Okay, good afternoon, good morning, and good night, wherever you are. My name is Jahendra Ski. I will be the chair for this session, and then I'm the vice director for research at the Institute for Economic and Social Research, LPM FEBUI. So in this session, what we are going to do is to listen a policy brief dissemination that will discuss the policy brief that has been written by a series of important people. So this policy brief will discuss the framework to enhance financing capacity and incentive natural assets preservation. This topic is really important given the fact that preserving natural assets usually falls into the responsibility of many low and middle income countries. But at the same time, countries or most of these countries usually have significant issues because they have limited fiscal space. In order to answer these challenges, it is important to really introduce some ideal framework in order to support financial capacity, in order to preserve natural asset, and we also want to hear the proposal proposed by this policy brief. So this paper will be presented by Mr. Matthew Agarwala. He is an economist at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, University of Cambridge. And also with us today, there will be two panelists that will provide insights and maybe their experience in order to how to ensure that providing financial support to many of these countries. So with us here, we have Mr. Amar Bhattacharya. He is a senior research fellow at Brookings Institutions and also the TF5 co-chair for the T20 India. Also, we have Ms. Nela Hedrieti. She is the head of Center for Regional and Bilateral Policy, Fiscal Policy Agency, the Ministry of Finance. And during this session, the presenter, which is Mr. Agarwala, he will have like 20 minutes of presentation for the policy brief, followed by 50 minutes of discussion with the panelists. And during the discussion, we will focus on the topic that will cover three things. First is the thing that has by development, affordable financing to preserve. What will be the role of G20 in supporting the creation of such initiative? So without further ado, I think I will start to give the time to Mr. Matthew Agarwala. Mr. Matthew, the time is yours.
Hello.
I'm sorry, my connection was really bad. I don't know.
Hello, and thank you. I hope that you can hear me.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I can hear you, Matthew. Yeah.
It is such an honor to be here in beautiful Bali, Indonesia, with such an enlightened group of experts. I've been learning a huge amount during the discussions earlier today. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay, so that I can share the slides. It falls to me, I don't know how the honor has come to me that I get to present the policy brief that I have been working on over the past few months with Professor Bamban and a number of co-authors from around the world. The title of the brief is called A Framework to Enhance Financing Capacity and Incentivize Natural Assets Preservation. And I think it's absolutely critical to the discussions that will be taking place at the G20 summit, because the topic of conserving natural assets, natural capital, is absolutely fundamental to our ability to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals and ensure prosperity, not just in the G20, but beyond as well. So for those of you who were here with us in the previous discussions, I apologize, there will be some repetition of today's slides, but only the first couple. The simple point that I want to make is that the world's economic model, which has pursued economic growth, specifically GDP growth, at all other costs, has generated substantial improvements in the human condition. We have improved life expectancy, access to education, to healthcare, food security, the empowerment of women and girls. There have been improvements in all of these, and indeed every measure of economic development in all parts of the world. Now, I completely agree that development and those improvements have been unequal, but there have been improvements in all parts of the world. The issue is that economic model of the pursuit of GDP growth is bearing different gifts today as we enter the quarter point through the 21st century. We have released 1 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. We have driven 1 million species to the brink of extinction. And we have failed to fully eradicate the inequality crises that we face. And combined, climate change, biodiversity loss, and inequality could wipe out that century's worth of gain. And so we need a new economic model, one that is fit for purpose for the 21st century. And the way that I'd like to describe that model is to imagine that I'm running a bakery. The size of the pie that we can produce in the future depends on the stock of ingredients in the pantry. Run out of ingredients, and tomorrow's pie will be smaller. One of the points that our policy brief articulates, and that we hope the G20 picks up, is that the economy operates in precisely the same way, except that the core ingredients of economic prosperity are not flour and butter and sugar. They are capital assets. Those assets include our natural capital, those elements of the natural world that support supply chains, that support life support functions, such as a stable climate system, nutrient cycling, crop pollination, fisheries catch, and that support well-being through improved air quality and places for outdoor recreation. It's also human capital, which economists have gotten wrong, largely, by focusing only on skills and education, which are critically important. But if human capital measures do not incorporate the health of the population, then they will be less and less relevant as time goes forward. Human capital is critically both the health and the skills of the population. Wealth includes our physical capital, of course, the infrastructure, the buildings, the homes, the information and communications technologies that we have. And critically, it must also include our social and institutional capital, the trust that we have in individuals, in governments, and in business, and institutional capital, the quality and reliability of our governance. Income measures the size of the pie. GDP is our pie. But wealth, these capital assets, our inclusive wealth, that makes up our economic pantry. And the model that the world has pursued over the past century or so has been to increase the size of the pie simply by raiding the pantry, and that is unsustainable. What we need is a new economic model that focuses on preserving and enhancing the pantry as we produce each year's income or GDP. And the reason that we need this, and the reason we need the G20 to take this up, is because capital is forward-looking. GDP will only ever tell us what happened last quarter or last year. But if we want to deliver a sustainable future with prosperity for all, then we must stop looking over our shoulders and start looking forward. And capital, by its very definition, is forward-looking. The value of any capital asset today is simply the net present value of the future flows of benefits that it generates. So the difference between an economic model that is based on forward-looking capital versus one that is based on backwards-looking income is like the difference between getting a diagnosis from your doctor beforehand versus waiting for the autopsy report afterwards. Economics, financial institutions, multilateral development banks, finance ministers, indeed, the entire G20 needs to start acting more like doctors and less like coroners. Now, the G20 earlier this year affirmed that they are working to include environmental economic statistics and natural capital accounts in the core economic statistics. But we make the case in our policy brief that this is even more important for the G20, because that's where most of the world's natural capital actually is located, but also because it is these economies in India and in China and in Brazil where the greatest co-benefits exist to preserving natural capital. That is where air quality is having the greatest dragging effect on productivity and human capital. And so it is where investment to improve air quality will yield the greatest returns. Now, one of the comments that I get at this point is always, this is big idea stuff, but it's not really practical. What are the banks going to do? What's the IMF going to do, the World Bank going to do? How are businesses going to evolve? And how can the G20 help stimulate a reorientation of the economy in pursuit of prosperity and wealth, rather than simply income generation? Well, I think I'm going to show you one of the highlights from our policy brief, which shows what it would be like if we took natural capital economics seriously and built into the financial system risk measures that actively incorporate the science around the changing climate and the loss of biodiversity, and what that would do to the assessment of risk and creditworthiness and debt markets around the world. And so one of the things that we've done in our policy brief is highlight how sovereign credit ratings, and therefore default probabilities and the cost of capital for countries, might change if we take natural capital seriously. So we know from climate science and ecological science that human economic activity is having a deleterious effect on the natural world. If you understand that climate change and biodiversity loss impose costs, both financial and broadly across the economy, then you must also understand that those risks should be factored in to the assessment of creditworthiness around the world. And so what we wanted to do was see if we could bridge the gap between what the science tells us about environmental risks and what the sovereign credit ratings are telling the markets and how they're affecting the cost of capital around the world. Now, there are two papers behind this. One of them is about to be released in the journal Management Science. Basically, the method behind it is that we train a little bit of AI to hack S&P's sovereign rating method, and then we feed it forward-looking projections of scenarios under different climate outcomes and different biodiversity outcomes. And once we feed that into our climate model, into our ratings model, we can get an environmentally adjusted credit rating. And this gives us a risk measure, a sovereign credit rating that is actively forward-looking. And if you are thinking about investing in countries, if you are thinking about the ability of sovereigns to service their debt, if you are thinking about the allocation of capital around the world, then only a forward-looking risk measure can really be relevant. A credit rating that can only tell me after the fact that something was risky is not very useful. So what's in our model? Well, we've got a very parsimonious model. We trained it and got it down to 6 macroeconomic indicators: GDP per capita and its growth rate, and then a few government performance indicators, basically around debt levels and debt to GDP ratios. We trained this on past ratings and found that we have very strong predictive capacity across the world. The exception is in sub-Saharan Africa. We have poor predictive capacity there, but many of these economies are not rated by S&P in the first place. So it's not possible to predict something that doesn't exist. We then adjust the ratings for different environmental changes. First, for climate change, under a low emissions scenario, largely consistent with the Paris Climate Agreement, and a high emissions scenario representing RCP 8.5, around 4.5 to 5 degrees of warming. We then allow those scenarios to increase the cost of climate change as temperature volatility rises. Because remember, it's not just the level of temperature that counts, but also the volatility. How high are the highs, how low are the lows, and how fast are those swings? That's what really drives up the climate costs. In a second analysis, we also adjust for biodiversity loss. Under a baseline scenario in which biodiversity is kept constant and there is no further loss, under a business as usual scenario in which the current trend of biodiversity loss continues, and under a partial nature collapse scenario in which we reach tipping points that destroy the service flows from various natural capital assets. And we use a range of scientific evidence from macroeconometric climate models, ecosystem, and environmental economic models to do this. When we pursued this research for our policy brief, we set ourselves 3 rules of engagement. We were not going to undermine the natural science, so we had to have a clear link from the science all the way through to our results. We were not going to break the rules of econometrics, so basically the stats had to be solid. And third, we wanted to remain as close as we possibly could to the way that credit ratings actually construct sovereign ratings. Credit ratings agencies construct the ratings. We wanted to do that so that our results were as comparable as possible to existing ratings. And I think we were able to do so because one of the co-authors was S&P's global chief sovereign rating officer. And so he issued all of the ratings that are actually in the sample. When we adjust them for climate change, we see that there are substantial downgrades. So these are notches, so say from AAA to AA on a 20-point scale. Under the worst case scenario, we see really substantial downgrades all across the world, including in Europe and in North America, as well as China, India, and Southeast Asia. But it's not just a story about 2100 under the worst case scenario. We see 59 sovereigns face climate-driven downgrades within the decade. So by 2030, 59 sovereigns, including G20 economies, face climate-driven downgrades under our model, even under a good climate scenario. What that means is that nobody can escape. But this is just the climate side. If we want to move to the biodiversity side, those are the ratings that I'm now going to show. And for this, we turn to a World Bank report released in 2021 called Making the Economic Case for Nature. And they analyzed a tipping point scenario focusing on 3 different ecosystem services: marine fisheries, tropical timber production, and wild pollination services. And what I'm showing you here is the results of their modeling of what would happen if there was a partial collapse across all 3 of those services. And I've highlighted a few economies of interest here. And the reason that I've highlighted them is not just because they're major economies, but because I want you to see where they land in the ranking. The World Bank estimates that under this collapse scenario, countries like India and China may face a 5% fall in GDP. Countries like Indonesia, it may be a little bit more than 10%. But look at where they are in the ranking on this slide, which is the GDP losses, compared to this new slide, which is the impact on the sovereign rating. And what happens here is, whilst they were in the middle of the pack on GDP losses, they are leading the pack in terms of how severely this will impact their sovereign rating. And that has a big impact then on the cost of capital. What this tells us is that we cannot rely purely on the GDP measure to understand how creditworthiness will change as a result of the collapse in tropical timber, marine fisheries, or wild pollination services in agriculture. GDP does not tell the whole story. Now let's look at where the rating changes, the downgrades fall along the rating scale. So on the left here, we have the highest rated countries, the AAA, AA countries. They face a small impact. The biggest impacts are going to be through the middle of the scale, the BBB and BB rated sovereigns. will face the largest impact in terms of downgrades in their sovereign rating. And the same is true of the increase in default probabilities that result from these biodiversity driven downgrades. The numbers here are really very striking. In the middle of the range, we're talking between a 10 and 20% increase in the probability of default if we have a collapse in just 3 of these ecosystem services. That is absolutely critical. These countries' ability to access sovereign debt markets in order to invest in all range of projects, whether that's physical infrastructure, the restoration of nature, or indeed mitigation and adaptation. But these impacts are heterogeneous across countries. We see that in some countries, such as Ethiopia or Bangladesh, we could be doubling or even tripling in India the probability of default. So the light blue lines here show the current default probability. And they add to that the dark blue lines to get the sum default probability if we have this collapse in nature. And so what does this matter to the G20? And why did we put this into our policy report, into our policy brief? It matters because if economies ignore natural capital, and if financial institutions and the G20 ignores natural capital, then the financial stability of the biggest economies on the planet is going to suffer. And sovereign debt is the asset to which we turn in times of crisis. And what our results are showing is that that safe asset, the flight to safety, is going to be a flight to turmoil if we do not manage our natural capital appropriately. And so I think as we look forward to the G20 discussions, we have to make the case for investing in natural capital. And the good news is that we have now the guidelines accepted by the UN General Assembly, endorsed by the United Nations, actually produced by the United Nations, to start developing natural capital accounts across countries. And indeed, more than 100 economies have begun to do so. The G7 has already this year affirmed a commitment to develop these accounts. I think it's time, and my co-authors and I think it's time for the G20 to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matthew, for your presentation. So I guess, as you've mentioned in your policy brief, it is really paramount for us to really considering or thinking about the capital conservation, because it's really important. Many low middle income countries will fall, as you mentioned in your analysis. So we have to really taking into account how we can ensure that we will provide some sort of innovative financing, probably by MDBs or international financial institutions that will provide some affordable financing and preserve these natural assets. So maybe I will invite Mr. Amar Bhattacharya and also Ibu Nela Henrietti to maybe discuss what Mr. Matthew has mentioned earlier. So there are 3 important topics that we need to discuss today. First is the creation of innovative financing mechanism by MDBs and international financial institutions that have already provided some affordable financing to preserve these natural assets. So maybe you can also give us some comments or inputs on whether this has been in place before. So for the first, maybe I will let Mr. Bhattacharya to give some comments.
Thank you. I hope everybody can see me and hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So real pleasure to be commenting on this paper, this brief. So one caveat, Professor Agarwala, the policy brief does not cover, all the ground that you mentioned. It's it's a distillation, intended, I think, for a wider audience. So the technical part that you covered I have not seen or heard before. So I'm a little handicapped in being able to kind of do a peer review of that. But I did want to say that the centrality of the key points you make are absolutely central. And as a peer reviewer, my job is to try and sharpen the arguments because I very much agree with them. So I would say that first question is natural capital, of course, is a wide-ranging set of assets that we are talking about, and I mean, within the G20 context, there are particularly some areas that are under big focus this year. But just to emphasize that, I mean, if you take climate out, which is what happens when you don't take care of the world's atmosphere separate, the kind of key natural assets we are talking about, of course, are land, water, biodiversity, and the action areas are, of course, then the ones that preserve this, including, of course, particularly biodiversity, because it is a hugely under-recognized asset, as Professor Dasgupta and you point out. But there are also other areas where the world is kind of seeing major declines, and that's degraded land. It's in water systems, both freshwater and ocean water, and supporting it, as you said, all of this, and of course ecosystems and biodiversity. But all of this has both a opportunity cost aspect associated with it, as well as risks and mounting costs, which is what your analysis suggests. So one question I have, one suggestion I have, is it's good to define a little bit what we mean by natural capital, and particularly emphasize that there are national benefits to this, and then there are, of course, major global benefits to it. So that's just a observation about the setting of the policy brief. And so then the second part is what is the role of the G20? And I took the arguments that you had and I sort of wound it into a slightly different narrative, but very, very, I'm very much in some sense informed and motivated by the arguments in the policy brief. So the first is, and I was also struck by this in your remarks in the earlier session, is the importance of leadership. At this stage, what we are lacking, I mean, in climate, as you correctly point out, we do have, not, complete leadership, but there's a huge amount of focus, there's a huge amount of attention, but we're not getting the same with respect to natural capital at large and with, biodiversity in particular. So we do need to find a way to kind of make sure that we are getting the global attention on this. And it is put in a way within one of your arguments, but I think it's worth bringing out more clearly that, at the international level, the G20 is the place to provide such leadership. I would underscore that as a very key point of your policy brief. Second, that this cannot stop at the global level. There needs to be, national leadership on this agenda. And, in that regard, I mean, the G20, both leaders as well as finance ministers have a key role to play. A second, very, very correct, recommendation is, what you measure is what you deliver. And, the measurement issue in natural capital has been plaguing us, but we are making good progress, lots of initiatives in this area. And what we now need to do is translate that into real momentum, which gets us, more comparable, assessments across the board that allow us basis for action. I should add also that in my very first point, the analysis that I did a couple years ago showed that 80% of biodiversity assets, actually more like 90%, are in emerging markets and developing countries, to include China. But within that, there is quite a lot of variability in terms of the endowment of assets. So that point also you need to, I mean, just coming back to the first point, you need to bring out. I mean, particularly in biodiversity, the three big systems of the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and the Papua needs to, I think, be emphasized that those are, under national boundaries, but they are huge global assets. Okay, coming back to, so as I said, in terms of what to do, the central importance of leadership at this point in time, and recognizing that this is not an area where the G20 has a very, very crucial role to play. The issue of measurement, where again, we do need a breakthrough, and we are almost at a point where we can get a breakthrough. The third part, which you do not emphasize, is the role of policy. I mean, just in the case of climate, we all, of course, get totally obsessed with carbon pricing, and somewhat correctly. But here, it is actually the valuation of ecosystem services that drives. Putting a price on it helps us make good policy, and we have good policy levers both on the revenue side and expenditure side to deal with it. So I think, recognizing the role of policy, and the G20 again can help develop this policy. And as I was arguing earlier, so can the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action, which indeed is focusing quite a lot on this particular topic. Then coming to the issue of finance, there are two separate issues on finance. And they are, under the two bullets in the policy brief, but it's worth bringing out the two separate dimensions a little bit more clearly. One is that financing, although there are ecosystem services that come from natural capital, they don't easily translate into revenue streams, and particularly the revenue streams that produce relatively quick returns, because these are very, very long-term benefits and lots of externalities here. So a fundamental challenge in the natural capital area is the prevalence of externalities of all kinds. So that makes the revenue model quite challenging and makes normal private finance quite challenging. But there's a lot of work being done in this area right now about how one can create, models around which private finance can flow. And UNEP is doing quite a lot of work in this area. But what we need is low-cost finance, and we need, in some cases, even debt-free and highly concessional finance. So you focus on MDBs, but I would say that there is a menu of options here where MDBs are a part of it, but you can think about, for example, carbon credits. Given the collinearity between carbon and biodiversity, especially when it comes to forestry, let's say, you can think about also biodiversity certificates with integrity. I was associated recently with a paper that we did for the Global Environment Facility on that. And you can think for debt for nature swaps as a mechanism. Given the tremendous value of this, you can think about what we are now in the Paris Summit basically saying, let's tax the bads, like pollution or lack of, say, carbon taxation and shipping industry or aviation or whatever, and use that money for good purposes. And I certainly am in the camp that some of that should go to, to biodiversity protection as an important. So the generation of adequate finance to support, in some sense, the urgency of action in these areas is very important. I also should say that particularly in this area, my Norwegian colleagues who have basically provided a lot of money, including in Indonesia on this, keep emphasizing that, you have to have an incentive compatible system of incentives and finance, because otherwise what happens is one area gets protected and, the destruction takes place somewhere else. So that's why I keep coming back. I keep emphasizing the role of policy. The last part is what you emphasize very much, which is the need to shift finance, in a way that recognizes risks. And your numbers are, of course, very powerful, that the risks embedded, in non-action are very, very high, but also to recognize opportunities, which you don't mention, because you actually could do a lot. Just like in the case of climate, if you did this, there would be a lot of payoff. So just coming back, I would say, I think this is an extremely important and timely brief. I think the main objective is to wake up the G20 and say this should be a very important issue for you, not just under this presidency, but as an agenda for continuing agenda going forward. Brazil offers a great opportunity to build, given that for Brazil, it's such a big issue. And, so making the case as you do for the tremendous benefits from focusing on natural capital and the tremendous risks. But as I argued, it's good to define the natural capital universe and, within that particularly highlight the special challenge of biodiversity. Then in terms of the action areas, as I said, leadership, measurement, policy, finance in terms of mobilization of finance from a wider set rather than just only MDBs, and finally shifting financial systems so that they are cognizant of risks and cognizant of opportunity. So those are suggestions. I think they can, for you to reflect on as you finalize your brief.
Thank you, Mr. Amar, for your very important comments. So I noted that you mentioned about leadership several times in your comments. So the thing is, it is really important for not only G20 countries, but also for local government to really put more attention on this particular topic. You also mentioned about the role of policy that is really important. Other alternative options like carbon credit, debt for nature swap, carbon tax, and other potential policies that may also can be adopted in many of these countries, especially for the incentive for compatible ecosystem mechanism. And yeah, other thing that have been mentioned by Mr. Amar is about shifting the finance thing to more regime that will provide more opportunity for these people, for these countries to also adapt this capital preserve. Maybe keep your response first, Mr. Agarwala, because Ibu Nela will also provide some comments, and then we can discuss later on for several topics.
I forgot something very important, and that is to say hello to my good friend Nela.
Okay, so, great. Okay,
so it's a special pleasure to be on the same panel as her.
Yes, thank you. Go ahead, Ibu.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And then, yeah, I plan already will greet you, Amar and Pak Jahan, and it's nice to see you again in the same session. And perhaps we can discuss some more. I mean, I know that you're very, very active in coalition. And to Mr. Agarwala for your inspiring idea in this policy brief. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to share my view in this session, Building Bridge to Sustainable Finance. Especially, we discuss about framework to enhance financing capacity and incentivize natural asset preservation. And I think similar to Amar, when I read your policy brief, and I actually wonder what is the natural capital you mentioned here. And then, but then I received a message from the organizing committee that we don't do peer review in here, but we just bring our analysis and then share our similar expertise. And Amar also, since Amar has explained very excellently about how to going this issue to bring this issue to international attention, and then how to attract attention and how to change an international order for this matter. So, and then I think in my capacity, I will explain what happened for Indonesia and using Indonesia case and how we influence the policy in the world for this matter. And also in here, I tried to narrow my scope that preserving natural capital in here can be linked to the government efforts for climate change under action and on mitigation and adaptation. That's also include that prevention of natural loss, and that's also damage and loss caused by the climate change. So I received also the points that we should discuss today, that how MDBs and international financial institutions can create innovative financing on this method. And then I read your policy brief. You mentioned about support domestic bond market in emerging economies, create innovative mechanism, and support natural capital measurement. Here I share what Indonesia case and how the role of MDB is helping us in setting up this framework on our policy. I support Amar idea, so we're not supposed to just rely on MDBs and IFs. That's also a leadership in from the national level, and then also the leadership in the regional level. So to bring to convert that kind of vision to a more realistic implementation. So here I will explain about energy transition mechanism, pooling fund for disaster Indonesia as part of Indonesia disaster risk financing insurance and the climate budget tagging. First, the energy transition mechanism, and one of the innovative mechanisms to reduce GHG emission through early retirement of coal-fired power plants. And the financing mechanism here is assisted by Asian Development Bank. ITM is a scalable collaborative initiative to leverage a market-based approach to accelerate the transition from fossil fuel to clean energy. ETM is focused on both public and private sector investment here toward financing the retirement of coal power assets. ETM was first piloted in Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. So ADB here is helping setting the scene and framework. And then it's quite well developed, and then now ADB actually expanding the initiative to Pakistan and Kazakhstan, and now they are in the pre-feasibility study. For Indonesia itself, we announced that ETM in COP26 in Glasgow in November 2021, and then also in launch Indonesia Country Platform to be managed by PT SME. Based on the Indonesia Ministry of Finance decree. And then this establishment of country platform is aimed at mobilizing international and private participation in financing the ETM project in a blended finance scheme that can be undertaken through modalities such as loan or refinancing, cash injection, counter guarantee, and equity investment. And now we also prepare and equip that concept by developing regulation to provide fiscal facilities to attract more private investors. So, and then the second one for our example is the framework of disaster risk financing insurance. Indonesia, we call a pooling fund for bencana. as a part of disaster risk financing. The DRFS strategy enables the government to accumulate the fund through state and regional budget and other resources. As you may know, the cycle of the budget, if the fund directly disbursed from the budget, if there is no disaster in that year, then the fund should come back to the budget at the end of the year. And then when disaster happen, it will take time to disburse again. And then, and because it wasn't anticipated, it will need reallocation and affect the existing allocation and hamper economic growth. So then with the World Bank, we create this pooling fund for disaster. The fund can be accumulated, and then the proceeds can be used for mitigation action like pre-disaster that include transfer risk of disaster to third parties such as insurance industry, and build a mitigation process for the climate change, and then include preserving biodiversity, and then to connect with the insurance industry that will have a positive multiplier to our financial sector, as well as this mechanism will crowding in domestic financing industry by creating more financial instruments. That's part of the innovative financing that you mentioned for disaster. Innovative financing for disaster. This mechanism is assisted by World Bank through program loan. The loan is accompanied by grants that help Indonesia to build ecosystem for this disaster risk financing framework. In this financing mechanism, we have this investment project financing with performance-based condition to ensure the regulation infrastructure for this framework to be well implemented. Even though it's a bit different, actually this concept we get from World Bank is also the learning example process that World Bank ever implemented in Mexico. The third one that we have from the MDBs, that a budget tagging. Since 2016, Indonesia has implemented climate budget tagging. It has assisted the government in identifying climate-related output and expenditure, and cumulative central government climate spending since 2016 until 2021 reached 502 trillion rupiah or 33.5 billion US dollar with a 12% growth rate. This success has been followed to many sectors, so we try to implement that to many sectors, including biodiversity. Currently, we discuss with some MDBs to build the tagging or tracking to disaster expenditure and biodiversity as well. So, and then since we have kind of like some number for the climate, we able to predict how much spending that we need to change our NDC target. With our previous NDC target, that before our NDC target is 29% with our own effort, 41% with international effort by 2030. We allocate the state budget 30.2% of total climate financing needs, or around 4 trillion rupiah per year. And then with the new target, NDC target 31.89% with our own effort and 42.38% by 2030, we also increase, we can predict our spending for our target. So, and with that, I think I can explain that we issue SDG Indonesia 1, we issue the Green Sukuk, and then we establish also a public service agency for environmental fund. So it's helped us to design our strategy for the financing for our climate change. So that will go to that's also go to the preserving natural assets. So, and then I go to the point of condition and challenge that must be addressed to create that mechanism. For the ETM, the main objective for the energy transition mechanism, the main objective is to shorten the economic life of the coal-fired power plant, early retirement of coal, getting additional reduction of greenhouse gas emission to achieve Indonesia NDC, and then gaining access to financing with lower cost of fund. So as the government has set up the ecosystem, we also the ecosystem that set up the PT SME, and then the government also set up the financial support for model facilities, the risking mechanism, low-cost refinancing, equity, performance-based payment, technical assistance, energy transition-linked subsidy, and also we transform that the fund from the clean energy fund mobilization from coal power plant is transformed to renewable energy that is designed in the National Electricity Supply Business Plan. And at the end of the day, the ETM process is expected to produce carbon credit that is potential to be sold in carbon market as well. So that's another innovative mechanism in the financing part. But as you know, there's also a lot of challenge in implementing this in the national level. How to ensure that in achieving our climate goals that we involve a whole economic transition. Therefore, how to minimize disruption to economies and livelihood and maintain social support for the net zero transition, mitigation of the environment and social impact of the transition is quite critical. Now, Indonesia is working on the Indonesia ETM Strategic Environmental and Social Assessment. That also include ESG. In the pooling fund for disaster, as I mentioned, that we set up the fund manager and administrator for the PFB, and then that administrator can accumulate the fund and develop the fund. On the other side, we create a regulation for the community line ministries and NGO to send their proposal to related line ministries, and we create a mechanism to for a group of ministries to assess the proposal, like Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Planning, and Ministry of Finance, and then the mechanism to disburse the fund. And we also have a challenge in this matter that in managing the fund and the disaster risk, we also have some calculator. We need to have kind of like calculation how to transfer the risk, what kind of the disaster risk should be transferred, and which one should be retained. That is the tricky part. There are two big challenges here: how to set up co-financing formulation with stakeholder, in this case is regional government, and how to have a reliable risk mapping to measure how severe and how frequent the potential disaster will be. And then we working on it, and then we also look to international standard how we gonna have a correct, like suitable calculation. As you know, in Indonesia, we have all the case, we have all the disasters. So we have the forestry as well. So we have a source to reduce the carbon emission, but we also have the case that what is the direct impact of the climate change. So, and then with that, we need to map the risk all around the countries, and then try to choose which risk that the government will cover, and then which one will be transferred. For the climate tagging, climate budget tagging, that's about the data. And then as I mentioned that then we can predict from the data, we can predict how much money we need. So we can determine the contribution of the state and local budget to addressing climate change, and then how the technical regulation should be put in place. And this one, we also get help, like I mentioned, that from UNDP, United Nations Development Program. They help us with the knowledge transfer and setting up the framework. And then the challenge again, how to give understanding to all the stakeholders that they need to take. They need to mark their budget, their spending, or their revenue that related to climate change. So in the role of G20, that here, like Amar mentioned, that's the leadership of the country, of the region, and then in the national level. As you know, the G20 is the only international and influential forum that has members from both and developed countries and cover most GDP in the world. So it means that G20 can bring the synergy to the table and make the developing countries' voice more perceived by global community. On the other side, The developing countries now are more connected and aware what is the topic they need to pay attention in the global level that will affect their economy. And they also have the opportunity to contribute to the solution as well. Remember that the pandemic affect the fiscal space, supply chain, trade, and the war in Ukraine also affect food and energy security. With that, country can discuss and design and create policy and initiative to tackle the situation. It is similar to this preserving national resources topic. Even though that climate change was initially discussed in UNFCCC, Paris Agreement, but G20 is the forum that enhance the discussion in the cross-sectoral way, bring not only experts, but also policymakers to integrate that initiative into policy. The discussion in G20 also stimulate funding from MDBs and international financial institutions, mainstreaming funding into the topic area based on the potential solution discussed in the forum. So as for example, as you know, in 2015 and 2016, the Sustainable Working Group, Sustainable Finance Working Group, Climate Finance Working Group were just a study group in the past, but that's because it's starting discussed in the G20 and become attract a lot of attention by policymakers. Now that's become working group. And actually, that's also influence Indonesia, that how they create this energy transition mechanism. And that become the transition finance is also Indonesia priority in G20. As developing countries, Indonesia encourage global community to recognize the transition process. That was mentioned before, but it's more, the transition process is more to technology. But when Indonesia presidency, that we also try to make that recognition on the reduction of GHG emission as well by early retirement of the source of emission, that's coal phase out. And then we bring that kind of leadership to the regional level. Then we bring that topic into regional forum like ASEAN. As you might know, that ASEAN has the ASEAN taxonomy version 1 on sustainable finance and provide the key, that taxonomy provide the key concept and design elements, including the multi-tier approach to assess the contribution of a project to reducing the carbon emission, or how a project in contributing to carbon credit. And then in Indonesia chairmanship this year, ASEAN issued the ASEAN Taxonomy version 2 on sustainable finance that focus on energy sector. This taxonomy includes the technical screening criteria and the plus standard, where the coal phase out is included in the tiers of technical screening criteria. The ASEAN taxonomy is the first taxonomy to publish we call it the technical screening criteria STSC for coal phase out, to encourage early action to reduce the region's reliance on coal as the major energy source. This effort is initiated by ASEAN member countries during Indonesian chairmanship, after learning the discussion in the world that we have to reach our net zero emission, like for Indonesia by 2030, and learn from the world standard that well-accepted taxonomy have not accommodated the energy transition with ASEAN countries' condition yet. So as you know, then coal-fired power plant in Indonesia is quite young. In not only Indonesia, in ASEAN countries is quite young and very productive, and most of our energy demand is supplied by this coal-fired power plant. So if we shut down them without a transition process that follow what happened in the world, it will negatively affect the ASEAN economy, especially when end up with the stranded assets. And of course, we will also trap in energy security. That actually also influence the world to see the transition in our point of view as well. Another example for the International Forum for Framework for Disaster Risk Financing Insurance, that's also discussed actually in APEC, and then in our forum ASEAN Plus 3. And then in the region, we also come up with the CDRIF in the regional level. That's also supported by World Bank. I think I stop here. I'm ready for the answer and question. Thank you very much, Jahen. Sorry.
Thank you, Ibu Nela. That was really great, very comprehensive. So I think we're really proud as Indonesia, because we have done a lot of things about energy transition, as Ibu Nela mentioned, from ETN to a polling fund for disaster, budget staging, and then everything has its own problem issues. And Ibu Nela has mentioned every issues that have been faced by the government when we try to implement these new initiatives. Also, Ibu Nela mentioned about where G20 has its significant role on ensuring that these initiatives can be adopted in many countries. So she mentioned about the Sustainable Working Group. It was initiated from the G20 meeting, and also the ETM. I also noticed that it was really discussed during the G20, and it was really taking to place now in Indonesia. So I think it's really great, Ibu. You provide us many new information, and probably it will fit to what Matthew has already mentioned in his policy brief. So what kind of policy that can be adopted? What are the challenges faced by these new initiatives, and what kind of things that we need to really take into consideration? And lastly, what are really the role of G20 or also other initiatives in supporting this initiative? So I think maybe because there are many comments from both Mr. Ammar and also Ibu Nela, maybe Mr. Matthew, you want to respond some of the comments or all of it? It depends on you. Feel free.
Thank you so much, both to Nelly and Ammar for these insightful comments on the brief and how it can be improved and enhanced, and for revealing your thoughts, and as well to Nella for that superb synopsis of the ambitions here in Indonesia around climate policy. I think I will try to take the points in order as they came, if that's okay. I'll try to synthesize somewhat to condense as well. Both of the respondents requested a greater emphasis on what is precisely the role of the G20. We've presented a good idea around natural capital accounts and inclusive wealth and tried to make a case that these things are important, but what is the role of the G20? And I think both respondents have also answered their own question, which is that it is absolutely the role of the G20 to take an ambitious leadership position. These are the largest economies in the world, but they are also some of the most politically influential. It's not just economic influence. And there is a role for leadership, not just as a G20 group, but also individually within the nations and on a global scale. I think Ammar made an extremely important point, and I am grateful to him for doing so, which is that although climate and biodiversity out in the real world, in the natural world, in the biophysical world, they are very closely intertwined. In the policy world, in the world of governance, and in our approach, our economic and financial approaches to addressing the challenges, they have not been so closely intertwined, and there has been a mismatch. For instance, the IPCC on climate was established in 1988. I was 2. IPBES, its Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service counterpart, was established in 2012. I was at university. On the climate side, we are on COP28. On the biodiversity side, we'll be looking to COP16. On the business side, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was established in 2010, I believe, and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures not until 2021. In the policy world, in the business world, in the legal world, biodiversity is way behind climate. And this is something that I would like to challenge the G20 to improve. You are absolutely right, Professor Bhattacharya, to bring out the fact that, yes, there's a lot of biodiversity and natural capital across the G20, but that it is extremely heterogeneous. And yes, that needs to be flagged. I agree there is a really important issue of measurement, and that is actually the bulk of the policy brief that my co-authors and I have produced. We focus largely around the measurement issue, because that's where we have the greatest chance to make an applied, practical, pragmatic improvement across the entire G20 with immediate effect. That is in development of natural capital accounts. A team of several hundred national accountants, economists, and natural scientists have been working for over a decade now on the system of environmental economic accounts. The central framework was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2012, and the ecosystem accounting framework was adopted by the UNGA in 2021. We have the roadmap, the rule book, the guidelines of how you start to develop these accounts and these measures. Now we need the next step, which is to develop them and implement them, and that requires the leadership of the G20. I think once we have these accounts and start using the accounts, they will help us refocus policy, because the accounts will reveal relationships, as all national statistics do, reveal relationships between important sectors of the economy. And at the moment, the exclusion of natural capital has essentially concealed that relationship rather than revealed it. And so I think that these natural capital accounts will improve the evidence base for benchmarking and scoring progress towards the sorts of policies that Nella has been speaking about towards climate mitigation and adaptation here in Indonesia. There's an extremely important point raised by Amar Bhattacharya about the non-market nature of natural capital and ecosystem services, and the fact that these externalities make it very difficult to mobilize private finance. And I think that is absolutely correct. That is the Achilles heel of all environmental economics, but it is also our reason for existence. And so we have to have something to say here. I think the challenge is largely around property rights, and the fact that the lack of the property rights over the global commons and over public goods means that the services from nature are indeed external to market decisions. And that is our major challenge. Now, perversely, it has been easier to establish property rights over non-renewable elements of natural capital: minerals, diamonds, gold, oil, coal. We have clear property rights and mechanisms for assigning those property rights. We grant mining rights. We allow permits for exploration for oil and gas. And the opposite is true for renewable natural capital around ecosystems, around air quality, around the fish, marine fisheries. And the result is that the lack of enforceable property rights means that the renewable natural capital is the stuff we're running out of first. And that has to be mind-blowing for anybody who understands the difference between renewable and non-renewable. How is it that the stuff that would regenerate itself naturally is the stuff we're running out of fastest? It's because we don't have these property rights. And I think there is a role for G20 economies to play in helping to establish and enforce those property rights. That is going to be key to making debt for nature swaps work in practice. That is going to be key for making carbon credits credible. And that is going to be key for ensuring that biodiversity is a fundable, bankable asset rather than an externality. It will be those property rights. I think there's just two more comments that I would like to address. I completely agree, Amar. I sometimes speak too much about the downside risks and not enough about the upside opportunities. There is a chance to put $100 trillion on the balance sheet. That's the lower bound estimate of the value of natural capital around the world, $100 trillion. We can put that on the balance sheets, right? And it would be a tremendous improvement in the way that we view and record and measure the economy if we did so. And the final word that I'll give is one of caution. Because while yes, climate and biodiversity are closely related in the real world, and there's sometimes a lack in policy, it is sometimes the case that what is excellent climate policy is in fact terrible biodiversity policy. Win-wins are brilliant when we can get them, but there are some trade-offs. And unless we have the accounts to demonstrate the trends over time in these assets, we run the risk of ignoring these trade-offs, and the result can be catastrophic for biodiversity. So I would like to thank, as deeply as I possibly can, on behalf of all of our co-authors, Professor Bhattacharya and Professor Hendrietti for the insightful comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Matthew, for your response to some comments and inputs from both Professor Amar and Ibu Nela. So I think both panelists, do you want to comment something, or is there anything that you want to add for Amar's policy brief? Sorry, Matthew, sorry. Matthew's policy brief, yeah.
No, I thought those were, everything accords, very closely with my views, and I think, this is a really very timely brief. So, I'm hoping that it will set not just the agenda for the Indian G20, but even more importantly now going forward, where we have Brazil and South Africa. So, I think this should not just be thought of as a policy brief, but actually a work plan for the T20. So we're very, very glad to see it.
Thank you, Professor Amar. So I think Ibu Nela, anything that you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Pak Jahan, and thank you, Mr. Agarwala and Amar Bhattacharya. So even though I didn't anticipate that you gonna say about the data, the measurement among the value of biodiversity, but one thing that I would like to emphasize that whatever the effort, I think that's feasible, and I saw the question about how the question is how to accelerate national capital accounting in developing countries. So I take the analogy that how the budget tagging works in our government, and then that actually will be expanded to other sectors. So we will try to really have a kind of like prediction how much the money spent, and then how much the assets created. And the other one that maybe I can take example that when we set up this disaster risk financing, and actually in Indonesia they step on assets there is no value before, so we plan to insure that asset, right? So that's why we do the valuation, and then actually we do kind of like pilot project, just the government assets first, and then just the building first, and then we expand to the bridge and other infrastructure. So and then from that we're gonna map the risk. So what Professor Agarwala mentioned in here is not something that far from implementation, but I think we should come with the methodology how we're gonna value this biodiversity, and then we collect all the input from the world, then maybe we can find how to bring that to our national asset. And then my point in the G20 as well, that what I learned from the international fora, that if there is a concept, the strong concept that's good, you just need like a group of countries that will really support that, and it's really suitable with their economy, and then they will bring that to the national forum, international forum, and then you just persistent with your concept, and the message should be clear, and then that drive us to the right direction. And the detail, there will be a lot of compromise in the detail, and then after the discuss, but still, this will bring a win-win solution to the world. I think that's my input, Pak Jahan.
Thank you, Ibu. So I think it is a pleasure to have Ibu Nela here, because Mr. Agarwala, you are presenting it to the right person at Ministry of Finance Indonesia. So I think the key word that she has mentioned, it is not far from the implementation. So maybe if it is possible, then probably the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia could also adapt some of your potential policies that probably Indonesia can also adopt in the future. So that's really important to note what Ibu Nela has mentioned earlier. So I think we still have 5 more minutes before we can close this session. We have one question on the Q&A chat box. So I think it goes to Mr. Agarwala. So there is one question, and I think you can just respond to this question, Professor Agarwala.
Yes.
Should I read it, or you can just respond it straight away?
Yeah. So the question is, how can developing countries develop natural capital accounts? There's a challenge around data collection. There is a challenge around valuation. And there's a challenge across how you do this at a subnational or regional level. And many economies do not really have the statistical capacity. I am extremely sympathetic to this concern. It is an extreme source of frustration of mine that the greatest capacity for accounting for natural capital exists in countries like the United Kingdom, my own country, where we've already lost it all. Right? We've already destroyed so much of what was the UK's natural capital. And it almost seems as though the capacity to account for it is inversely proportional to the actual stock of natural assets that's out there. I think the World Bank deserves really substantial credit for its work through the WAVES program, the World Bank WAVES program, which helped build capacity and demonstrate use cases for natural capital accounts in developing countries all around the world. I think that Indonesia deserves some credit for its work with Rob Smith in Canada through IISD, which has been developing natural capital and inclusive wealth accounts for Indonesia. There is an extreme need for environmental economists around the world and for national accountants from developed countries to share the capacity and build the capacity in developing countries. Absolutely. With that said, I'm not letting anybody off the hook. When it comes to climate change, it is a globally mixing pollutant, absolutely. When it comes to biodiversity loss, local land use regulations and enforcement or lack thereof are a major concern. And that is within the gift of the countries in the developing world. On top of that, the UK Office for National Statistics, for which I have tremendous respect, employs between 4,000 and 5,000 people. Maybe 3 of them are devoted to natural capital accounting. It's not that large an imposition on the budget for a country like the UK, a G7 economy. I think that technology is going to radically reduce the cost of developing natural capital accounts. I think remote sensing technology, I think real-time sensors, I think modeling, ecosystem service modeling, land use, satellite imagery, these can all really accelerate the pace of development, but also reduce the cost of development of natural capital accounts. And the final comment on this is that, yes, information is costly, but ignorance is costlier still. And if these economies are going to develop, if they're going to deliver a sustainable and prosperous future, they're going to need the data and the evidence base to benchmark policies and design that future, because it won't happen on its own, and the market won't deliver it without the leadership of the G20 economies and their finance ministers.
Great. Thank you. So it's already 3 o'clock here in Bali. So I think
Pak Jahan, may I add
yes.
something? Pak Jahan,
Sure,
address
Bu.
Agarwala mentioned.
Yeah.
Actually, in Indonesia, we starting doing the accounting for biodiversity asset. We have national accounting biodiversity asset and then we do two valuation to the piloting of a national park. There's Gunung Gede Pangrango and Taman National Park Semeru, Pak. And I think that can be a pilot project, and we combine that what other country doing. Then I think Indonesia will be happy. I mean, to show the example how we do that. And then Mr. Agarwala said, even though it's still small group in UK, and then with the help of MDB's international organization, we can start the discussion and then how to do the accounting for this asset. That's Pak Jahan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question, Nella, for you in the same vein. So on budget tagging right now, is it only restricted to climate, or are you also using that was one question. And the second one is, the mangrove initiative that Indonesia is pursuing is really a pioneering one. I didn't hear you mention that. So, I thought that one is actually, it's a novel way, not only about, about not just protection, it's about restoration, and it has an interesting financing structure to it.
Thank you, Amar.
Yes.
For the budget tagging that now is comprehensively implemented, that's only for climate. But now we start doing that for the disaster, and then a small part of that for the biodiversity. But the challenge that how to set up the suitable regulation for that. And then because the budget tagging is more to the how much we spend for the mitigation, and then the mangrove that you mentioned actually is part of our climate adaptation. So the budget tagging is not going to that yet, but so learning from what we're doing in the climate budget tagging, that will go to other sector as well, Amar, and maybe you can help us as well with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Nella. So I think we don't have any question on the Q&A box, and I think it was a really fruitful discussion for each from Matthew's presentation, and also comments from Amar's and also Ibu Nella. So really looking forward for this policy brief. I mean, the final version of the policy brief, and I think Ibu Nella will be very interested to see whether it is possible to really adopt this initiative from Matthews, and looking forward for any kind of future collaboration. So I think I would like to conclude today's session, and thanks for every speakers from Matthew, Professor Agarwala, Professor Bhattacharya, and Professor Hedrieti for their comments for this session. I think it is really interesting, and then providing us really comprehensive discussion about anything that need to be adopted, especially related to the capital preservance. And then I think looking forward again to any kind of discussion on this similar topic. For those who are going back to, Professor Agarwala will going back to UK, Professor Amar will go back to the US, I guess. Have a safe trip, and then see you again in the upcoming discussion for T20 seminar. Bye-bye, and thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and congratulations, Professor Agarwala, to you and your team. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you, Bu Nella, ya, Bu. Bye.